back to my channel. In this session I am planning to discuss something about the anastomosis around elbow joint. We know again this topic is a bit confusing for you, so I thought I will try to make it easy for you. And for the UGs, undergraduates, you can simply remember two arteries in front and behind the epicondyles and two branches at the olecranon. But for postgraduates, you have to add some more arteries. I will be mentioning it. So let's begin. So why you need anastomosis around elbow joint? We know this is a joint which is frequently flexed. So what will happen if we have the brachial artery running through this joint, and whenever we try to flex the joint, that brachial artery will be kinked, and what will happen? The rest of the upper limb will be suffering from lack of blood supply. So ultimately the whole part of the upper limb will be undergoing a gangrenous change due to lack of blood supply. So in order to avoid this condition, even when you bend your elbows, there should be a continuous flow of blood from the brachial artery to the branches of the radial and ulnar artery. For that purpose, we have an arterial arcade around the elbow joint, and that is what you call as anastomosis around elbow joint. So, it's mainly between the brachial artery of the arm and the radial and ulnar arteries, which are the terminal branches of the brachial artery in the forearm. So that it is just like a bypass or another route through which you can shunt the blood from the brachial artery to the radial and ulnar arteries when you flex the elbow and when the brachial artery is kinked. So let's see one by one. So the artery mark 1 here is the brachial artery. So this is the brachial artery, which is actually continuation of the axillary artery. Now we know there is radial artery and ulnar artery, the terminal branches of the brachial artery. We call it as radial artery and ulnar artery. So this is the radial artery marked 2, and this is the ulnar artery which is marked 3. Now we have two major branches from the brachial artery in the arm, which is anastomosing at the elbow joint. So in order to make it easy, we can say that we have the medial epicondyle, we have the lateral epicondyle, and we have the olecranon process of ulna. So we have the arterial arcade surrounding these epicondyles and olecranon process. So in front of the medial epicondyle, behind the medial epicondyle, in front of the lateral epicondyle, behind the lateral epicondyle, and over the olecranon process. So these are the sites where we mention about the anastomosis around elbow joint. So let's see first the branches arising from the brachial artery. We have the superior ulnar collateral as the first branch, which is lying actually medially, and we have the inferior ulnar collateral, which is the second branch below the superior ulnar collateral, again which is lying medially. Now we have to say, out of these two, which are seen in the anterior compartment or which are actually contributing as a branch lying in front of the medial epicondyle. So we can see that superior ulnar collateral, as soon as it is formed, it pierces the medial intermuscular septum. This is piercing the medial intermuscular septum, and it passes to the posterior compartment. So the dotted line represents back, posterior compartment, and it goes behind the medial epicondyle. Whereas inferior ulnar collateral, we can see that it is shaded bold. That means it is lying in front itself, in front of the arm, and it is actually dividing into anterior and posterior branches. This is the anterior branch and this is the posterior branch. So anterior and posterior branches. So the posterior branch, so anterior branch is bold and it is lying anteriorly. The posterior branch, it pierces to the posterior compartment and it is divided into a transverse branch and descending branch. That is, the posterior branch of the inferior ulnar collateral is dividing into transverse branch and descending branch in the posterior compartment. So in the anterior compartment, you mainly get the inferior ulnar collateral and its anterior branch, which is actually anastomosing in front of the medial epicondyle. So these are the main branches arising from the brachial artery. Now we will move on to the profunda brachii. So we have this as the profunda brachii, which is actually a branch arising from the brachial artery, and this is seen dotted. Why? Because it is seen in the posterior compartment in the spiral groove and lying along with the radial nerve. From the profunda brachii, we have mainly two branches. The one branch which is coming anteriorly, you call it as radial collateral, and the one which is seen as dotted, which is lying in the posterior compartment itself, you call it as middle collateral. So, radial collateral and middle collateral, or you can also say it as anterior descending and posterior descending. Radial collateral as anterior descending branch and middle collateral as posterior descending branch. In some of the books, instead of these collaterals, these words will be used, anterior descending and posterior descending. So the artery which is shown as bold is lying anterior to the lateral epicondyle, and the artery which is seen dotted is actually the middle collateral, which is lying in the posterior compartment posterior to the lateral epicondyle. So these are the two branches from the profunda brachii. Now let's see which are the branches arising from the radial and ulnar arteries. So we have two terminal branches for the brachial artery. This one is the radial artery marked as 2, and this is the ulnar artery which is marked as 3. From the radial artery to the anastomosis around elbow joint, we have only one contribution which is going up, that is known as radial recurrent artery, which is marked 9. So radial recurrent artery is the only branch contributed by the radial artery which is going up to anastomose in the elbow joint, around the elbow joint. So this is actually seen as bold line. That means the radial recurrent is seen anteriorly, and that too anterior to the lateral epicondyle. Now we have the major artery, the ulnar artery. From the ulnar artery, there are mainly 3 branches contributing to the anastomosis. The first one is anterior ulnar recurrent. So this is the anterior ulnar recurrent. We know this is shown as bold line. So all the arteries which are seen in the anterior aspect are shown as bold lines for easy purpose. So this is a bold line. So anterior ulnar recurrent means it is going back. Similarly, likewise, we have a dotted line just parallel to the anterior ulnar recurrent. This is posterior ulnar recurrent, which is going towards the posterior aspect of the medial epicondyle. Then one important artery which is arising from the ulnar artery is common interosseous. Common interosseous, which actually divides into anterior interosseous, which is not taking part in the anastomosis, and we have the posterior interosseous, from which there is a dotted line which is again running back, running upwards. So all the arteries from the radial and ulnar arteries are named as recurrent arteries. If it is from the radial artery, it is radial recurrent. If it is from the ulnar arteries, anterior and posterior ulnar recurrence. And if it is from the posterior interosseous artery, you call this as interosseous recurrent, and it is shown as dotted line. So it is in the posterior aspect, and it goes posterior to the lateral epicondyle. So 2 arteries anterior and 2 arteries posterior. So which are the anterior ones? Radial recurrent and anterior ulnar recurrent. Which are the 2 posterior ones? Posterior ulnar recurrent and interosseous recurrent. So this is the main thing which you should know in order to think about, in order to understand the anastomosis around the elbow joint. Which are the arteries lying in front of the epicondyles and which are the arteries lying behind the epicondyles. If you know these arteries, then it is easy for you to understand the anastomosis between the 2 sets. So let's see one by one. First, in front of the medial epicondyle, we have the inferior ulnar collateral artery, its anterior branch, along with the anterior ulnar recurrent, which is actually lying in front of the medial epicondyle. Now, behind the medial epicondyle, it is mainly the superior ulnar collateral and also a descending branch from the inferior ulnar collateral, which is anastomosing with the posterior ulnar recurrent from below. Likewise, the lateral epicondyle, in front we have the radial collateral artery or the anterior descending branch, and from below we have the radial recurrent artery. Radial means this is the lateral aspect, isn't it? So remember the radial arteries in front. Now the dotted line, that is behind the lateral epicondyle, we have the posterior descending or middle collateral anastomosing with the interosseous recurrent artery, which is a branch of posterior interosseous artery. Now there is one more point, that is around the olecranon process of ulna posteriorly. So posteriorly means we have to show all the branches as dotted branches. So which are the arteries? We have the branches arising from the posterior descending or middle collateral, and also the transverse branch arising from the inferior ulnar collateral artery. So these are the major branches which are anastomosing around the elbow joint. If you know the concept and if you know which are the arteries lying in front and behind, it will be easy for you. So understand the type of branches and then try to draw, then it will be easy for you. So you have to show mainly the medial and lateral epicondyles, then you have to show the radius, then you can show the dotted lines for the posterior branches and bold lines for the anterior branches. So first you draw the brachial artery, which is dividing into radial and ulnar artery. Then you can show the profunda brachial artery. Then you have to show the branches from the brachial artery, two branches superior ulnar and inferior ulnar collateral, branches from the profunda brachial again to the radial collateral and middle collateral. Then from the radial artery only one, that is the radial recurrent artery, and from the ulnar artery we have three, anterior ulnar recurrent, posterior ulnar recurrent, and the common interosseous, which divides into anterior and posterior interosseous. From the posterior interosseous we have interosseous recurrent artery. So this is again a favorite question for most of the entrance examinations. So please study it and please let me know whether it was useful for you. Thank you so much for watching.